unique. So we hope to be finished after about 20 minutes each, back and forth. So we're going to talk fast and show you lots of data, and then we'll give you some opportunity to ask your questions. We'd like to spend a good bit of time with questions. So, Stephen?
Thanks, Berwood. Yeah, as he said, there's a lot to cover, so buckle up. This is going to go pretty quickly. I talk fast as it is, so now it's really going to be hyperspeed. All right, so I think most of you know that the president's party almost always loses seats in midterm elections. This is going back to 1946, House seat losses for the president's party. The average is about 26 or 27 seats in a midterm. There are two outliers there, 1998 and 2002. If people are interested in what happened there, we can explain later, but got to move on. The Senate, the pattern in the Senate is similar, but not quite as stark. So some years the president's party does okay. That's just a function of what particular states are holding Senate elections in a given year. There are theories about why this always happens to the president's party that we don't have time to get into, but they have to do with maybe differential turnout in a midterm versus the presidential year, or sort of a balancing that swing voters want to balance out the president's policy agenda by moving things back to the center, or more commonly, just a sort of the midterms are a referendum on the president. And that judgment typically isn't a good one for the president at this stage in his first term. And so the indicators that we have are mostly for how the president's party will do are mostly about president's performance. And so what I'll talk about for most of this is what we can expect in the House. The Senate, again, is a little idiosyncratic, so we'll circle back to those later. But the president's approval rating is the thing that most highly correlates with seat loss in the House. And so you can see that here, that generally speaking, the higher the president's approval rating, again, these are midterms going back to 1946, the higher the president's approval rating, the better the president's party does, which basically means the fewer seats they lose, because they're almost always going to lose seats. This year, you can see by the red dot that the president's approval rating is at about 42%. That would indicate about a 40-seat loss. It's also the case, this is not about president's performance, but it is the case, it's a sort of a structural factor that the more seats a party holds, the more they can lose. And that's because as they expand a majority, they're winning seats they probably don't have much business winning. They're winning in sometimes kind of enemy territory. And so when things swing back, they're going to lose all those seats. This year, as you probably know, the Democrats' majority is very, 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 very thin in the House. So again, there's a decent correlation here as well between the number of seats held prior to the election and the number of seats the president's party is going to lose. This year, the Democrats have 222 seats in the 435 person chamber. And so that's a very thin majority. That would suggest losing maybe around 25 seats. And then, of course, the economy is always an important factor, but the problem with it is that it's not always clear what indicator we should use. So you might use unemployment rate, but maybe strangely, it turns out that doesn't correlate with seat loss at all. You might look at a measure of consumer confidence, but that's also weakly correlated. Inflation is also weakly correlated because we almost never have high inflation during a midterm election. I'll come back to this in just a minute. But probably the best indicator is change in real disposable income. And so you can see here that as real disposable income grows, the president's party loses fewer seats. This year, the change in real disposable income in the second quarter of the year, because people start to make up their minds about what they think about the fall pretty early in the year. And that's the best indicator, is the second quarter change in real disposable income year over year. So this year to last. This year, it's off the charts. We have never had, going back to 1946, a midterm election where the change in real disposable income was this bad. It's negative 5.5. That would suggest a seat loss of about 60. We could also look at the generic ballot. So this is just in national polls, a question of do you plan to vote for the Democrat or for the Republican for Congress? And this is the result of just regressing the generic ballot on seat loss. And so historically, it kind of tells us where we might be able to gauge what will happen this year if we know what the generic ballot is saying. And so you can see at zero, meaning Democrats and Republicans would be tied in the generic ballot, you would still expect the president's party to lose 15 seats. It's a midterm election after all. This year, the generic ballot depends on the poll aggregator that you look at, but it's somewhere between Republican +1 and Republican +3. So the left-hand column there is the Democratic advantage. So it would be -1 or -3, which would suggest a loss of about 17 to 21 seats. So when you look at these, and we're trying to project what's going to happen this year, it could be anything from 15 or so to 60. But the generic ballot is suggesting a better year for Democrats than the other indicators, which is kind of unusual. And so that's probably because of a number of different things that we can look at now. It's creating a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of interest in the election, but interest is higher among Republicans than it is among Democrats. This is a very recent poll from NPR, PBS NewsHour, just asking people, what percentage of people are very interested in the election? And so the top group there are people who also answered the question that they're leaning toward Republicans, voting for Republicans this year. And so I don't know if you can read that, but most of the Republican groups are in the high 70s in terms of a great deal of interest in the election. On the Democratic side, you can kind of see the bars are shorter, there's just less interest. In fact, the least interested Republican-leaning group, people without a college degree, are more interested than virtually all the Democratic groups. And I'll point out the very bottom bar, which is young voters. So this is a special a point being made to our students. Gen Z and millennials, 52% of them are very interested in the election. So lagging quite a bit behind. But still overall, there's a lot of interest, and that makes it hard to figure out exactly what turnout is going to look like. If more people are interested than normal, then our normal models might not apply this year. Of course, everybody's interested in the impact of the Dobbs decision and the abortion issue. So let me deal with that quickly. So this is a chart of the generic ballot throughout the year. And it's, where the red line is on top, the Republicans had an advantage. The blue line is Democrats. The faint line kind of in the middle there is marks June 24th, which was the day the Dobbs decision came out. And what you see is a little bit of movement in the Democratic direction, but also movement in the Republican direction. But then eventually Democrats kind of catch up to the Republicans. It's not until early August, though. So it's a month and a half. You would expect that decision to have some lag time, but I think that's a long lag. I would expect to have seen better Democratic performance a little bit earlier than that. Democrats don't move ahead of Republicans until early September. So that's 2.5 months after the Dobbs decision. And there's a lot going on in August. There's the Mar-a-Lago search, which put Donald Trump back in the headlines. And anytime that's the case, Democrats get an advantage. There was the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in middle of August. So kind of good news for Democrats throughout the month of August. And that may have been driving these numbers as much as anything. So might gas prices have been driving things. So if you look at the sort of shape of the Republicans' fortunes, it's kind of a U shape from summer to early fall. It follows that pattern. The arrow there at the bottom is when Democrats were at their peak in the generic ballot. So it could be as simple as Democratic fortunes rise and fall with gas prices. Another way to look at this is also from that latest NPR PBS NewsHour poll. They asked people, what's the issue that's on top of your mind when you think about voting this year? Slightly different question than what's the most important issue facing the nation. Obviously related though in lots of ways. And what this shows is the black dot is the overall percentage of people saying any one of these three issues. And then the colored dots are the parties, Green's independent. So you can see that overall, most people are saying inflation is top of mind. But that's extremely true for Republicans, 54% of whom chose that issue. Only 17% of Democrats chose it. But if we're interested in knowing what effect abortion would have, we see that it comes in third among these three. The second is preserving democracy. And just 22% of Democrats say abortion is top of mind. Now, to be fair, that is much higher than normal. In a normal year, abortion would not even register on a list of issues that are top of mind. It would be about 4%. So 14% overall is quite a bit higher than normal, but it's still not clear that that's driving a lot of people's behavior. Notice 4% of Republicans also say abortion is top of mind. Hard to know exactly what that means without digging into further data. Those could all be pro-life voters, but some of them could be pro-choice Republicans. And that would be a good indicator, I think, for Democrats. The impact of inflation, as I said earlier, is also unclear. And that's just because inflation, it doesn't normally correlate highly with seat loss, but that's because almost always inflation's in the 1% to 2% range. There have only been two midterm elections going back to the 40s that had inflation anywhere near what we have now, which is 8.2%. That was in 1974 and 1978. Republicans suffered huge losses in 1974, but probably not because of inflation. It was Watergate, right? So you kind of rule that one out. And then you look at 78, where inflation was about where it is now, a Democrat in the White House. And Democrats had a much bigger majority. So that issue of the more seats you have, the more you can lose, they had a majority of something like 257 or something. And they only lost 15 seats. So was inflation really driving behavior? Not likely, or maybe minimally. So that would suggest inflation this year might not have an enormous impact, although lots of people are saying that they're facing hardships because of inflation. So it's clearly a problem. It's just a question of whether it's driving behavior. Ultimately, in close races, and there are many of them around the country, what matters is candidate quality. And what also matters is sort of local conditions. And so we'll come back to candidate quality a little bit later, but I'm going to turn it over now to Berwood to talk about those local conditions. How does the state match up to the national context?
Thank you, Stephen. Lots of interesting stuff. And I think what you're going to see is that many of the conditions that we're viewing nationally are also holding in Pennsylvania. And so if we think about what's happening in the state currently, we know that voter interest is high, just like it is nationally. We know that the state's political environment tends to favor Republican candidates. But at the same time, we see candidates running for statewide office who are underperforming. And that means that at the moment, we see a Senate race that is a toss-up and a gubernatorial race that is inexplicable. But I'm going to take us through each of these elements just so you can see for yourself the elements of these different things. So let's begin by talking about voter interest. This data comes from our Franklin and Marshall College poll. And this is midterm data from 2006 through 2022, last polls that we do close to Election Day. And you can see that 2/3 of Pennsylvania registered voters tell us they're very interested in the election. About 90% tell us that they are going to vote, which translates to about 50% adult turnout in the state, which is about what it was in 2018. So the conditions on the ground seem to be similar to what we saw in the last midterm. Now, as Stephen said, nationally, we saw that Republicans had an advantage in people who were going to turn out to vote. What we've done with our poll is we've looked at our likely voter model, people who say they're very interested in voting and very interested in the election and certain to vote. And this particular slide shows people's self-identification from being strong Republicans to strong Democrats. And the blue bars represent likely voters and the red bars represent all voters. And so basically what this shows us is that the Republican leaning groups, despite the strongest partisans being pretty much equally likely to vote, as you might expect, when you start looking at the partisan groups, particularly those leaning towards Republicans, there is a bit of an advantage there. The Democratic groups that we would normally, you would look to help support Democratic candidates, Their blue bars are smaller than the red bars, so that indicates less interest. So there's clearly an advantage here for Republicans. Now, I just want to tell you why this is important. This is a bit of a complicated slide, so I'll give you, we are in a lecture hall though, so I feel comfortable sharing this with you. This is a panel of data from 2000 and 2022 from a recent poll. And so back in 2000, the black bars indicate Democrats and Democratic leaners. The gray bars indicate Republicans and Republican leaners. And what you see very clearly is that in 2000, we used to have conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. We don't have those things very much anymore. Partisans have moved from the middle to the extremes in their parties. You notice the large share of conservative Republicans compared to where they were just 20 years ago. We still have a good group of moderates in this state in both parties, but as you can see, the parties have sorted themselves ideologically, and that means, this is why we have, for instance, less split ticket voting. People are aligned ideologically, politically, and they don't split their ballots anymore like they used to. And this is why voter interest is so important, because if you have more Republicans turning out, they're going to favor Republican candidates and vice versa. So that's the voter interest question. How about the state's political environment? Well, the news here is not good. Stephen showed you some of the economic indicators that are sort of abstract. This one's not abstract. This is a timeline going back years from our F&M polls that ask people how they're doing financially. The orange bars are the percent of voters who say they're better off now than they were a year ago, and the red bar indicates those who are worse off. That's 49% of voters. Half of all voters tell us they're worse off financially than they were a year ago. Those are terrible numbers for an incumbent party. Now, not surprisingly, who gets the blame? The party in power, as Stephen was discussing. Here are comparisons in this state of the favorability ratings, or the job approval ratings of President Trump, President Obama, and President Biden at similar points in their presidencies. And Biden's numbers are exactly where Trump's were in 2018. And they're actually about where President Obama's were in his first midterm, a midterm where he lost 63 seats. So those indicators would suggest, again, a favorable environment for Republicans. I thought I'd just share this with you quickly. It's what the president gets credit for. And I thought you'd like to see this compared to President Trump's numbers at the same point. President Trump got better ratings for his handling of the economy than President Biden currently gets. He also performs about the same in handling foreign policy and did better, comparatively speaking, on immigration issues. So it's interesting where the presidents got credit, and you could argue that the jobs one is the most important one. We also talked about the generic ballot question, and we saw that nationally. These are the numbers in Pennsylvania since the spring. And it was pretty clear that Republicans were going to have an advantage over Democrats in terms of interest and motivation and preference for candidates. You can see that the gaps narrowed in August. Maybe that was Dobbs, maybe that was gas prices, but there was certainly some difference that we saw here in preferences for congressional candidates. That gap has once again widened. So it's clear that these conditions, whether we're talking about the economy, whether we're talking about presidential approval, whether we're talking about the generic ballot, all of those things favor Republican candidates. But what's interesting to know is that the Republican candidates themselves are really underperforming. Or if I were being positive, the Democrats are overperforming. One of the reasons for that has to do with the Republican candidates being viewed less favorably than the Democratic candidates. So this I'll show you in a second the gubernatorial candidates. This shows us the Senate candidates, Mehmet Oz and John Fetterman. The red in these bars indicates the proportion of voters who have an unfavorable view of those candidates. And the green bars are favorable views. So you can see that large numbers of voters in this state, even Republicans, have an unfavorable perception of Mehmet Oz. In fact, he's about 19 or 20 points underwater. That is, more people have an unfavorable than favorable view of that candidate. John Fetterman at one point had a positive rating. Now he's a bit underwater, a few points. I think something like 13% of voters have an unfavorable opinion of both candidates, which is important to understand because we don't know, that adds to some uncertainty. We're not sure how those voters are going to vote. But clearly in this race, you can see that the personal characteristics or the personal attributes of the Republican candidate, he's viewed much more negatively than the Democrat. That's also true in the gubernatorial race. And here, Josh Shapiro is the only candidate of the 4 statewide candidates who is viewed more favorably than unfavorably by the state's voters. So, the typical approach for any candidate is as you get better known, as you spend money on advertising, that you become viewed more favorably. That's the hope. But oftentimes that's not the case because of negative advertising. In the race for governor, however, there's been very little advertising by the Mastriano campaign. In fact, he has not run what we would call a traditional campaign by any stretch. So not much TV advertising, not much interaction with the media, not many public events. So I guess you could call it a campaign somehow, but he's really, I think, not done his taken a typical approach to the race. The other issue they have is that the partisans who are to support them don't like them. Now, this question we asked of both candidates. Are you satisfied with your party's candidate? So Democrats were asked about Fetterman and Shapiro. Republicans were asked about Oz and Mastriano. And about half of Republicans say, gee, I wish we had a different candidate. This is another reason that they are underperforming. So that brings us to the race itself. The gubernatorial race was a little closer till Josh Shapiro started really advertising and really has had the field cleared for himself. And so his advantage is about 10 points. It was about 10 points in September. It's still about 10 points. And it looks like, from all indications, that he's going to win this race. On the other hand, the Senate race has narrowed considerably. And so we're probably talking about a 1 or a 2 point race. However, this advantage still leans towards the Democrats. John Fetterman, despite what some were concerned about in terms of his debate performance, has not seemed to have lost any ground. And this seems to be the natural flow of the campaign. By the way, I wanted to mention something about the gubernatorial campaign. It'll be the most expensive in history, the most spending by one candidate in terms of Josh Shapiro. Josh Shapiro did something that no candidate has ever done in Pennsylvania. He ran a television advertisement every day since April. That never before happened in our state. So he's had the field largely to himself, and you can see what happens as a result of that. Now, this one's a little complicated too, but I wanted to just share with you the margins between candidates going back to 2000s in this state for presidential candidates, P, Senate candidates, S, and gubernatorial candidates, G, okay? The color indicates the party who won. So Democrats have won 12 out of 18 statewide races of these types of races. But what's most important to take away here is, on average, gubernatorial races are decided by about 10 points. Senate races by about 2. So the patterns that we see here in this race look a lot like they have been historically in this state. Now, there are some things we don't know, and Stephen hinted at a few of these things. We're not sure about which issues will matter most. We're not sure about ticket splitting and factionalism. These concerns that Republican voters have about their candidates, is that going to matter when they get to the voting booth? We're not sure about polling, and I can talk more about that later. But we're going to wrap up by talking about the context. Before I turn it back to Stephen, I want to talk about the issue set. Now, polls only tell us what we ask them. Or, we ask questions in certain ways, and people respond to those questions in the way they're asked. And one of the things that's curious to me is when we ask about the most important problem facing the state, which is the middle column here, the general concern, you see what's at the top of the list, undoubtedly the economy. Abortion doesn't get mentioned, and crime is at 10%. But if we ask a question about why are you voting for the Senate candidate or the gubernatorial candidate, notice how the issues get flipped. Now, partisanship and ideology is at the top of the list, shouldn't surprise anybody. But look what's second, abortion. And that's for both sides, pro-life, pro-choice, more pro-choice, I would say, than pro-life, but we get both of those. Economy is third, crime barely registers. So one of the most uncertain things that confronts us is what's going to matter when someone steps into the voting booth? Which of these issues? Because I think if it's the economy, it's a bad day for Democrats. If it's not, perhaps they've got a fighting chance. The other thing I want to show you is how Republican candidates are underperforming at the moment. So we've got 3 questions that we ask. The generic ballot, do you favor a Republican or a Democratic congressional candidate, which is the bottom row. Then the gubernatorial race and the Senate race. I've circled in red what we call traditional Republicans. And you can see that 90% of traditional Republicans told us in our last poll they were voting for a Republican for candidate. No surprise. However, only 60% of them said they were voting for Doug Mastriano for governor, and only 79% said they were voting for Mehmet Oz for Senate. So again, the Republicans are underperforming largely because a segment of their voters isn't sure about them. What we don't know about is whether when it comes time to vote, they will stick with these preferences or revert to their usual behaviors, which is voting for Republicans. So in the end, it's going to come down, I think, to candidate quality, which Stephen is going to talk about.
Yeah, I should just mention, maybe you've said this, but in these faction questions, which we've been asking for a couple of months now in the poll, but the self-defined factions, those are people who call themselves either a Trump Republican or a traditional Republican. So we let them self-define which faction of the party they're in, and same with centrists and progressive Democrats. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff about those factions, but I think that point is a really important one. I also want to just circle back for a second to the projections for the House seat losses. Even if this is a good Democratic year, and Democrats hold losses to say 15, I mean, again, political scientists would say they were sort of defying, history there, and yet they'll lose the House. They have a 5-seat majority. So even if they lose just 5 seats, which would be amazing, they'll lose control of the House. In the Senate, of course, it's 50-50, right? So they can't afford to lose even a single seat. And I think in these very close races, candidate quality is going to matter. Mitch McConnell himself said just a few weeks ago that the House is likely to flip to Republican control, but he wasn't so sure about the Senate because in the Senate, candidate quality matters. That was a backhanded way of saying we've got a bunch of crappy candidates. And he was talking about, I think, maybe Masters in Arizona, where Senator Kelly only serving a two-year term after a special election in 2020 is for some reason doesn't perform well in that state. He didn't perform particularly well in 2020 either. That's a race that Republicans should be ahead in, but their candidate, like Masters, has not been very effective. Probably everybody knows of the woes of Herschel Walker. In New Hampshire, here's a vulnerable Democratic incumbent running against a really fairly extreme and quite weak Republican candidate. Republicans could have nominated a more mainstream Republican who would probably be ahead in this race, but they're a little behind because of that. Laxalt also, probably not the best candidate that they could have chosen in Nevada, but that race is very, very close. I think a different candidate is ahead by several points. This is true in Ohio with J.D. Vance, and of course in Pennsylvania, where Fetterman, I think that these are the polling averages from 538 and from Real Clear Politics. I'm pretty sure those have tightened just in the last day. I think I made these a day and a half ago, but the Muhlenberg College poll came out just yesterday and is 47-47 in that race. So this is a very close race, but in a good Republican year with a candidate who resonates more with Pennsylvania voters, the Republicans should easily be ahead in that race. You can see this also just in terms of candidate quality, in terms of how much money they're raising. So the candidate spending column is how much the candidates themselves have raised. The parties and outside groups, super PACs, come in and try to make up the difference. So the total spending differences aren't as great as they are for the candidate, but the candidate spending tells you how effective is that candidate at raising money. And you see that Masters has raised under $10 million, or spent under $10 million, compared to 74 million for Senator Kelly. The Vance race, Congressman Ryan raised $45 million, J.D. Vance just $9 million. Even in Pennsylvania, that looks like it's closer in terms of candidate spending, but 20 million of that is Oz's own money. 27 million is his own money, so that takes you back down to 10 million. So these candidates in really competitive states are barely able to raise $10 million in a year where, look, there's hundreds of millions of dollars being raised and spent. So it's, again, just an indicator of their candidate woes. I've highlighted these three because, I don't want to make a prediction, but if we look ahead to what might happen in the Senate, and as I said, I think the House is gone. I don't think there's any way Democrats lose fewer than 6 seats or fewer than 5 seats. But in the Senate, it's going to come down, I think, to these three races. So the Pennsylvania race, if Democrats lose 2 of these 3, they lose control of the Senate. Nevada, incredibly close, but the Democrats have a really good get out the vote operation in Nevada. My guess is I think that's their best bet. I feel like my hunch about Pennsylvania is that it's likely to go to Oz, but I think Berwood disagrees with me on that. So that could really go either way. And Georgia's going to go to a runoff. So in Georgia, you have to win a majority, 50% plus 1 of the vote to win the seat. There's a third-party candidate taking enough of the vote that I don't think any candidate will get 50%. So there's a runoff on December 6th. So it could be that Georgia runoff is for all the marbles. And so, these spending numbers will quadruple probably in December. So let me just end with this. We have to sort of, I think, address the reality that increasingly some candidates refuse to concede. They refuse to accept the legitimacy of the election. And this is a report in Rolling Stone by one of our alums, Swin Subsang, who reported that, talked to people who were in a meeting where Trump and Trump advisors were saying they're going to use Pennsylvania in particular, but some of the other states in 2022 as kind of a dress rehearsal for 2024. What they mean by that is aggressive legal challenges. We could debate how appropriate aggressive legal challenges are in a democracy, but candidates have a right to challenge outcomes if they think that there's something wrong, and it works its way through the court system the way 64 or 65 Trump lawsuits worked their way through the courts in 2020, right? So if all they're doing is challenging results in court, that's one thing. I think the concern is that if a number of candidates refuse to accept the outcomes, do some supporters of those candidates take matters into their own hands? And I think, it might sound alarmist to say that there's a threat of violence in Pennsylvania and in other states, but I think we've seen enough evidence that we've got to take that seriously and be prepared for it. One last thing I'll say, and then we'll take questions, is that you should be prepared for and expect the way the vote counting will go in the state. In Pennsylvania, we're not legally allowed to start counting mail-in ballots before Election Day. Many states do. So they get 1 million mail-in ballots. They start opening the envelopes and putting them through machines before Election Day. In Pennsylvania, we're not allowed to start counting mail-in ballots until 7 o'clock in the morning on Election Day. And so it'll take some time to count those ballots. What you'll see reported out in Pennsylvania first will be the mail-in ballots that have been counted throughout the day. So when polls close at 8, the first results will be the mail-in ballots from that day. It's likely to be a Democratic advantage because Democrats, 78% of the ballots that have been returned to this point are from registered Democrats. But then the machine ballots will be reported. The votes that were cast on machines that day, on Election Day, will be reported later that evening. That's going to give Republicans a surge, and they'll more than likely in at least in the Senate race, maybe not in the governor's race, they're likely to move ahead. But then as the rest of those mail-in ballots get counted over the next 24, 48 hours, the movement will be back toward the Democrats. This is what President Trump exploited back in 2020. He said, this just doesn't make sense. I was ahead, and now where are these magic votes coming from? They're not magic votes. They're mail-in ballots that just take a long time to count because you have to open the envelope, then open the security envelope, then slide each ballot through the machine. It's going to take a while. This year, fortunately, the localities are counting ballots continually through the night. In 2020, they stopped at some point from exhaustion, went home, slept, came back the next morning. This year, they'll be counting continually. So we should get the results more quickly, but that pattern of results and the way they're reported, don't be surprised if Republicans take a fairly big lead, and then that shrinks and maybe even Democrats move ahead as the mail-in ballots come in. So let me stop there, and then we can take questions.
Come on down. Come on down and ask your questions. You can form a line here or over there.
Hi, Candace Roper. I am a retired staff member. I am interested to know your thoughts on whether polling is becoming more partisan or what else it might be becoming more or less of. Not to be cynical of polling, but
Sure. Well, look, I think we might have thought that this question would come up. These are the results from the primary polling, which were spot on. These are our results. And I'm not sure that there's anything wrong with polling. I think that what's wrong is the way that we use polling. So think about all of the data that we just shared with you that comes from polls that has nothing to do with the horse race. The issues that matter to people, the performance of the president, the inclinations towards the candidates. All of those things are important sort of contextual features of an election that you wouldn't know if you didn't have a poll. So I think as long as we keep in mind that polls are imprecise, they always have variability associated with them, that they can tell us a lot about an election, but the truth is probably 15% of voters on election day go into the ballot box not quite sure who they're going to vote for. So if they don't know, how am I going to know? I think that's a fair question. So I think we just keep in mind what the polls can do well. And the fact that, they're less good at predicting the future than they are at telling us what's important to people. Keep that in mind, and I think they're just fine. But I will add this. Polls are used in partisan ways, right? So we do have, I think, people that drop polls into the polling averages to affect them, not to show us the direction of the race. We wrote a piece in early August about the fact that there were some pollsters showing almost no one undecided in August. Give me a break. So, we talked about that. And so you got to know that not every poll is a good faith effort too. And you should keep your eye out for that. I think the poll aggregation has made us a little lazy and thinking that every poll is the same when, polls are done differently for different reasons with different purposes. And so if you know that, maybe you get a little better sense of, of what's going on. So I don't know. Did that answer your? Yeah. I mean, look, we still get Republicans and Democrats, people from all parties participate in our polls. So I don't think there's a hidden group of voters somewhere that we're not reaching. But we'll see, if the problems, one of the things that's interesting, hi, Matt. One of the things that's interesting, I'll hurry. But one of the things that's interesting, and Stephen said we should have put this in our presentation, was if you look at the pattern of polling misses over the last 25 years or more, 2016 and 2020 were unusual in their bias, probably because Trump was on the ballot. The rest of the pattern of errors, it varies back and forth between the parties, and it's not very big. And so I think 2018 was a good year for the polls. I suspect this will be a good year for the polls as well, that, there'll be small errors, but not any, I doubt we'll see like a huge movement in one way or the other from the polls.
Can I just add one quick thing? But that poll aggregator thing is an important point because, it depends on what polls you include in your aggregation. And if you're including not very good polls, then the aggregation is not very good. And there are increasingly these polls that come out of nowhere. Nobody's heard of the pollster. It's a random thing. It's probably partisan motivated. And if an aggregator picks one of those up, then it's skewing the results. So those aggregators should be, and I think they try, the reputable ones, look for reputable pollsters, ones with a track record. But if they're not, then it could be quite misleading. Yes, Professor Skousen.
President Biden has been trying to make the argument that democracy is on the ballot. You don't see Democratic candidates talking about that, and it doesn't seem to register, at least in your polling. I'm wondering a two-part question. Why do you think Biden's doing it? And is it a mistake that Democrats haven't picked up on that and made that an important issue?
Yeah, so why do I think Biden's doing it? I think Biden sincerely believes that democracy's under threat. I mean, you could disagree with him, but I think he believes that. Are Democrats making a mistake? I mean, it's hard, there's only so much you can focus on in a campaign. You can't talk about every single issue. And so you have to, it's very short-term oriented, right? What's going to move voters right now? And so, strategically, I don't know if it's a mistake to not be talking about democracy, but I do know that, political elites, when they talk about things, people listen, and they're, especially people who trust them, will pay close attention. And so, part of the reason so many people believe that 2020 was a rigged election was because the person they voted for president said so. Like, not everybody's going to investigate it themselves. So if Democrats were more commonly saying, more regularly saying, there's a real threat here, it would probably rise, on the list of important issues. But it's sort of abstract. So at the end of the day, it's kind of like, well, what does it mean to threaten democracy? I don't exactly see it like, okay, not conceding an election seems bad, but is that really what we're talking about? Are we talking about some kind of dictatorship? How's that going to happen? Like, it's all abstract. And so I think it's just a hard issue to get people to pay attention to and then also act on. But that doesn't mean it's not important and that Democratic leaders shouldn't be talking about it.
Steve Ulrich, class of 1982, retired staff member, managing editor of Politics PA.
This was all off the record.
This was all off the record, exactly. With Pennsylvania Supreme Court making their decision on mail-in ballots, especially in the Senate race, we may not be looking at election night, more like election month.
Mhm.
That said, what will the two of you be watching most of all next Tuesday night with the Senate race?
Well, I'm looking at right now the returns, the mail ballot returns, and there's been a million ballots already returned. I think it was 975 or something yesterday. And if you look at those, and you look at kind of the partisan support, you have to think that Josh Shapiro probably has 525,000 vote lead or so from the mail-in ballots. And I think Fetterman probably has about a 375,000 vote lead. So I'm going to watch those returns because there's still about 500,000 or 600,000 outstanding ballots. So that's one thing I'm going to keep an eye on, how many people actually return them and what's the distribution between the parties. I think then the other thing that I'm going to watch are some of the congressional races. I think the 7th and the 8th in the Lehigh Valley, and there are two Democratic incumbents up there, one of whom is in a seat won by Trump. Actually, it's the only Democratic seat in the nation that was also won by President Trump. And so we'll watch that district, Matt Cartwright's district, and we'll watch Susan Wild's district in the 7th. And if those two get wiped out, then it's going to be a rough night for Democrats. If they can hold their own and stay tight, I think that's going to be important. And then I guess the last thing I'm thinking about, we haven't talked at all about the state house, right? We should all remember that there are new congressional maps and new state house maps because of redistricting. And the new state house maps are actually much more favorable to Democrats than the last round of maps. And so I'm wondering if there's a lot of things to wonder about, but when you think about what looks like a large Shapiro advantage, who does he drag across the finish line with him? Maybe it's Fetterman, but maybe it's also a congressional seat or two. But what about those newly constructed seats down in the Southeast? Does he drag some people with him there? And so, it would be interesting if we had, in what we expected to be a really rough Democratic year, if you saw something happening in the state house that we didn't expect. So I think those are the things I'm looking
I
at.
agree. And I'd just say maybe turnout in Philly. How strong is it? And what are the splits? So, the Democrats got to be getting 80% out of Philly. If it's maybe a little higher, if it's 79 or 78, I mean, literally that much of a difference that could matter. But turnout in Philly, I think the splits in some of the suburban counties, Chester, Montgomery, will matter. So, yeah.
Well, there's still time. If you have questions, you can come on down, but we have some Zoom questions as well. So a staff member asks, what does conservative really mean anymore for Republicans? Is it not what it used to mean in the past?
Berwood? It does not seem to mean. Okay, one way to think about this is that ideology might function differently in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And for Democrats, a lot of the ideology is about the groups that matter to them and their equal treatment, and they're getting the things that they're asking for from government. And that's kind of what it means to be a liberal. And in fact, lots of people who don't even consider themselves liberals or Democrats have liberal views when you think about policy positions, because political scientists refer to this as operational ideology. It's like, what if ideology is about the positions you take, then let's just ask people about their positions. Don't ask them to self-identify because they may not know what the terms mean. Ask them what their issue positions are, and I can tell you whether you're a liberal or not, even if you don't think you are, right? And more Americans are liberal than conservative operationally. But more Americans are symbolically conservative. There's something about the conservative label that's very attractive to many Americans. And so if symbolism is what conservatism is really about, it's things like culture and identity, and which is ironic because people think that liberalism is about identity politics and conservatism isn't. But in fact, conservatism is probably more driven by identity. And so what does it mean then to be a conservative? It means whatever symbolically the sort of leaders of conservatism are saying it is. And that might be increasingly something like, maybe not all the way toward, but something like Christian nationalism. But it's probably not low taxes, low regulation, strong military. I mean, it's part of it. But, you know, there's lots of ways where you can see this sort of falls apart. I mean, support for the police has always been a kind of staple of conservatism. And there are all kinds of ways in which there's questioning of the FBI. There's questioning of the police at the Capitol. There's questioning of the police in San Francisco now in the Pelosi attack. We don't trust them. We don't believe them. So back the blue, what does that mean anymore, right? So I think if you think of conservatism as this more symbolic kind of thing, it'll morph quite a bit, and it'll be defined by people like Donald Trump. I mean, you can pull out a sort of an ideology out of the Trump movement. He won't always define it that way, but you can see things: nationalism, populism, right? But that makes for tension within the party, because our factions question. The mainstream Republicans are still holding on to this idea of a Republican Party that wants low taxes and low regulation, but increasingly might not have those policy positions. So there's tension within the party, but just like there's tension in the Democratic Party too.
I think I would just, I agree with Stephen. I think there's a lot of symbolism in this, but it's important to understand when we ask about operational ideology, it aligns with partisanship and it aligns with where people live. And so we shouldn't treat it as if it's not something real to people, because when you ask them about specific policy positions and you add those up, it's operational ideology is different in Philadelphia than it is in southwestern Pennsylvania, and it's important to keep that in mind. It tells us something.
Okay, there's another Zoom question. If no one else has a question here, could we see Berwood's slide again about if voters wish their party had chosen a different candidate? What do people say about Mastriano and Shapiro?
Well, I mean, you can clearly see the differences. The gray bars represent, I would have preferred a different candidate. And remember, this is about partisans. This is asked of partisans about their candidates for office. So, part of this comes, to be fair, from the fact that there were 9 and 7 candidates in the primaries. So you had a really divisive primary with lots of different options. But it also comes, I think, from something we just discussed about the factionalism within the party. At the moment, despite the kind of back and forth between moderates and progressives in the Democratic Party, you certainly probably see more tension within the factions for Republicans. And the primaries were really about those different factions. And so I think that's what we're really seeing here. Second, many of their voters just don't see these people as likable, right? Personally likable. So, ideologically, they're not aligned with you, and personally, you don't like them. So maybe you feel this way.
Yeah, one interesting question to consider is how would the Republicans be doing in the Senate race in particular with a different candidate, right? And so they had really 2 other options. Kathy Barnett, I think, was the sort of third place kind of candidate who was very much in the MAGA Trump role. That would have excited a lot of the MAGA voters, but probably similar maybe to Mastriano, turned off a lot of more centrist Republicans. But they had an option in McCormick, Dave McCormick, who was a much more sort of mainstream Republican, tried to do his best to get the Trump endorsement and didn't. But maybe he didn't try that hard because I don't think it's who he really was. So had he been able to come through and get the nomination, I mean, he still would have had some vulnerabilities. He's a big hedge fund guy, so Fetterman would still have run the kind of class-based kind of argument against him, but he would have been way more satisfactory, I think, to more Republicans. Although, who knows? I mean, the Trump voters may have themselves then said, "I'm not satisfied with him." So I think that's. I don't know what in the gubernatorial race. I guess they had some other options too, but none of whom were really contenders for the.
Yeah,
for the
the other thing to remember or to realize is that Oz won the primary with the smallest share of the vote in 100 years. So, I mean, one of the things that Stephen and I frequently talk about is electoral reform. If we had runoffs or ranked choice voting, maybe we'd have a very different looking race now. And I think an important thing to remember about any of these elections, I think it came through when Stephen talked about the number of seats affecting the outcomes. The systems and the system itself affects what you get, right? And so we might not have a Doug Mastriano or a Mehmet Oz or a Fetterman for that case, because if we had a different system of voting, you could get different outcomes. And so, that's important to remember, I think.
Thank you so much for your talk today. And thank you everyone who came and everyone who's watching on Zoom. And we look forward to seeing you next week.